All right, this is designed to be a very quick introduction to HTML and CSS. When we're talking about front-end development or code that gets executed on the user's computer, which is a lot of a web application, we're talking about HTML, CSS, and some kind of scripting language, often JavaScript. To be clear, HTML is structure. It's exclusively where things go. CSS is design. It focuses on what things look like. And JavaScript is action. It's what different things can do. We're going to start off talking about HTML. The first thing to understand is that HTML, everything goes inside a tag. You can think of tags as different boxes that together make up the entire screen. And each of those boxes are going to fit together in whatever way you think is best. Here, I have a list of some of the most common HTML tags that you'll use to build a web page. By no means is this an exhaustive list. As a matter of fact, there's a very large library of different kinds of tags you can use. However, if you open up the code to any website that's out there right now, these are the tags that you're going to see be used a lot. And I wanted to give you a finite list just so it's not overwhelming and you think that it's this never-ending list of combinations. So you've got some things that have to do with the actual structure of your website. You put things in the head, like the browser knows to look there for certain things. Meta information that explains some about what your site does, the title that goes up in like the tab in your browser, links to some outside files. Body, as you can imagine, is where all the stuff that's what gets displayed to the user goes, and footer can involve like copyright information. Divs and spans are some of the most commonly used elements, and they're also some of the most generic. This just means a part of the screen. These elements right here are specific to text. The H stands for header. So in a website, you could have a header 1, a header 2, a header 3, and these could all look slightly different. P stands for paragraph. Then we have bringing things into our website or going places. A link brings something in to the website. You might link to a CSS file so that the other file with that CSS gets brought into our website. An A tag takes the user somewhere. This is how you create links that go to other pages, which sometimes can be confusing with link. Image is, as you can imagine, for bringing pictures in. Lastly, with HTML5, which came out a couple of years ago, we started seeing some more customized names. The only reason that these exist, with a couple of exceptions, is to help make the organization of your code easier. You could put everything inside a div tag, but it might be kind of confusing to find something you're looking for. But now if we have a navigation tag, a main tag, and a side tag, a header tag, these tags just help make our code more readable, which is a really important part of programming. So anyways, with that said, the order HTML is written is the order that it appears. And elements can either be sequential, as in one thing after another, or they can be nested inside of each other. So we're going to take a look at what that might look like. Here is some HTML. You can see we've got doc type HTML. This always goes at the top. We're telling the browser it's an HTML file. In our head, we're linking to a CSS, which we're not going to look at yet. It's just to help make the demonstration more obvious. And then in our body, we've got several different divs. Hello, this one has the word each, this one has the word of, and you'll also notice I'm giving this element a property. And this is a very common property called ID. And it's a way for other languages, and sometimes even HTML, to know what an element is called. So I'm going to name this first, I'm going to name this second, another. You can use underscores. This is a special way of writing out names. It's called camel case, where the first word is lowercase and every word after is uppercase. What's important is that this is readable and makes sense to your code. It's important to know that you can never have two elements with the same ID, because that would get really confusing. Just like when you're in a room, if there's two people named John, you have to start figuring out other ways to identify a person. Here we have nested elements. Notice each of these, the element starts, then you have what's inside the element, and then the element closes. These are sequential elements. Here we have nested elements. We've got a div tag, the word we, but then inside, and notice I indent, this is a common way of writing HTML, I have another div that's inside this div. And then this div is inside this div, which is inside this div. This is called nesting. So let's see what this looks like in a web browser. You can see this file is called sequential_nested.html. I've saved these files on my desktop in a folder, so I can go to that. And you can see here's all the files for this demonstration. The HTML document, if I right-click on it, I can go to Open With and open it in my browser of choice. When I do that, it loads up the file. So this is the HTML file we just created. Some of the colors I added with CSS, which we'll get to later. Remember the first elements, hello, each of us are divs, were all sequential, meaning one after another. So there's the first, the next, and they're all just appearing on top of each other in the order they were written. Below, we have nested divs. Notice the first div is the outside box. Then we have a div inside that div. This div is inside that div. And this div is inside that div. This, once again, is called nesting elements. Now, it's very common when you're dealing with HTML that divs will act as containers for text elements. So let's take a look at another file that's pretty similar. However, I've got my body. I have a div called first, just like in my last file. But now I'm nesting inside that a text tag. I use the h1 tag here that says hello, and then I end that element. So this is the opening of that tag, this is the closing, and inside of it is an h1 tag with the word hello. This is another div with an h2 tag nested inside of it. This div has a paragraph. This div, I used a link. Remember I said the a tag allows us to go somewhere else? Well, an a tag has a property called href, and href just means a reference or a place to go. And so this link's going to take me to Google. Inside of this element, I have an image that I'm using, and you can see that I have to locate the source of that image. Here I've got another div with an aside, one of the new HTML5 tags, which actually is going to look pretty much the same as our paragraph tag. And then here, the nested divs remain the same. So let's take a look at that file. Here is sequential nested with text. You can see the h1 tag is the biggest. The h2 tag is the next in size. Then we've got a paragraph, which is even smaller than our headers, as we would expect. Notice the link is that kind of funky blue, and now we can change all this with CSS, but if I click it, it's going to take me to Google. I have an image built in here. This is the aside, which pretty much looks exactly like the paragraph. And I also want to point out that these text elements caused their parent div elements to take on some properties. Like notice there's some spacing here that was not in our original file. This kind of spacing is also things that we can fix with CSS. Now, I highly recommend going to goggles.webmaker.org. This is a website that activates an X-ray feature that allows you to hover over any element and actually see what kind of tag it is. That's an H1, that's an H2, there's an image. We can actually begin to see how websites are constructed. And what's really great, I'm going to hit escape to close out of that. If I drag this to my desktop, it's going to create a link that then on any website, I can just click that and it will activate X-ray vision for that website. So I can begin to see that any website is just made up of these exact elements that we've already looked at. Now, why do these websites or this website and other websites you may look at look so good, and why does this not? Well, that comes in with CSS. So we're going to open up the exact same document, but we're going to get rid of that CSS that I built in there, which created those colors and stuff. And we're going to begin to look at how CSS works. So right here, I have the HTML document that is used in that file. You can see that I've got the div first, hello, exactly like the last document we looked at. But I'm linking to a different CSS file with _css.css. Here's that file, and right now it's blank. The first thing that I want to do is I want to change the size of this element. Well, this is the only h1 element. And even if it wasn't, I may want all of my h1 elements to be the same. So in CSS, I can address something just by the name of its tag and say h1. Now let's make the font size even larger. So I'm going to type font size, and I'm going to use 5em. Em is a unit of measurement that's relative to the size of the screen, and this helps make fonts scale when you're looking at them on mobile. So it's better to use em than other dimensions like pixels or maybe even percentage. If I come back now to my website, and I refresh the page, you can see that the h1 tag is now larger. If we go back to our HTML, we can see that this was also in an element with the ID first. So I can come back here, and instead of saying div, because I don't necessarily want to impact every div, I only want to impact the one with the ID, which is the # first. And now I could say the background color is going to be blue. And if I refresh my HTML page, you'll see that div's background color is blue. Now let's say that I want each one of these text divs to be the same height. I could come into my CSS and give every single div a height of, let's say, 100 pixels. But I would have to address this one and this one, each by their own unique ID. That's going to be really time consuming, and if I want to go back and make a change later, that could be frustrating. So I'm going to give each of these elements something other than an ID. I'm going to give them a class. And a class is something that lots of different elements can each possess the same class. So that's going to be called box, that's going to be called box, that's going to be called box. And now in my CSS, I can address that class by typing a period and the name of the class. And I can say height of 100 pixels. And now every element with that class will suddenly adopt that trait. You can see all of these elements are now evenly spaced out at 100 pixels. This is the power of CSS. In one line, I've impacted lots of different elements on my page. Now, a couple of elements in CSS that are really important to understand. I'm going to look at a couple of common properties. We've used font size, background color, and height. Here are some more common styles. You can use background color, height, width. Notice you can use pixels, which is a fixed amount, or you could use percentage, so as the window size gets bigger or smaller, so does the element. You can use margins and padding. These are often confused, and I want to be real clear about the differences. The margin is the space outside of an object. The padding is the space inside of the object. So if we look at this drawing, this dark gray box here is my element. I can push it away from other elements by using margin, which will increase the space outside the element. And I can also take the text that's inside of it and push it in to give it distance from the edge by using padding. The area directly outside of an object is called its border. You can see I have a display property. Display properties are really important in CSS. A lot of elements start off with a default display property of block, which means it takes up the entire width of the screen. If I want something to sit next to another element, I'm going to need to change its display property to inline block, and that means there can be multiple elements in the same horizontal line. There's a couple other ways to accomplish that effect, but that's outside the scope of this tutorial. Lastly, for text elements, there's some special properties that are related specifically to text, namely font family, font style, font size, the color of the text. There's several others. If you Google search CSS properties, you'll see that there's a very large list of properties. No developer sits down and makes a set of flashcards and memorizes all of these. You use them as you need them. As you're working on developing something, you may think, wow, when I want there to be more text inside of this box, I want scroll bars to appear. Well, if you Google search that, you'll find that overflow is the property that you need to use. So don't feel overwhelmed by the large list of properties. You'll discover them as you need them. The last thing in this tutorial is there's a website that I've built that's a pretty simple HTML and CSS site at this URL. If you go to that website and you right-click anywhere, you can see View Page Source. This is going to show you the exact HTML, which you can then copy and paste into your favorite text editor. This will allow you to not only see all of the code that goes into that website, but for you to then make your own modifications and changes. You can also see linked into the HTML file is a separate document called style.css. If we go back to that website and we click on style.css, it'll open up the style sheet in a separate page, which you can copy and paste over. So I highly recommend beginning to manipulate these source files and see how your changes impact the overall way that the page looks. Thanks a lot.